Okay, so brief recap of yesterday. Okay, so yesterday we read the second Shoresh of the Rambam's Middos in its entirety. And Rambam basically says that not everything that is learned out from the Middos Torah Nidreshes is counted in Taryag, but you have to differentiate that his rule is if there's no pasuk, but there is a drasha, then the question is, do Chazal say it's Doraisa / Guf Torah, or do they not? If they say it is Doraisa, then you count it as Taryag and Doraisa. If they don't say it, then you assume it's derived. Okay, that was one major point from yesterday. And then the other point we saw was that we went into the question of like the drushos and how that interplays with Masorah. So he said that when you see drushos deriving something, then you have to differentiate between which drushos are unanimous and there's no machlokus on lahalacha. Those are from Moshe at Sinai, because there's no such thing as a machlokus on something that was given at Sinai. But then drushos, other drushos where there is a machlokus about how to apply the dinim, Middos Torah Nidreshes behen, then that was evidently not from Moshe. Okay. Let us. Oh, and then let's go to Halbertal, which we only briefly started reading. We are on. Okay, hold on. I have to figure. So we started on the section started on page 116. I kind of want to like rev up into it because at the bottom, revelation and interpretation. 116, I think. Did I get that right? Yeah, 116. Yeah. Okay. So he paraphrases the Rambam. That's not everything derived using the 13 hermeneutic principles for interpreting the Torah, or by extension by Reboy, is worthy of being enumerated. And then, so this is a point I was thinking about that I wanted to iterate to emphasize here. So he says this continues the goals of the first rule, namely isolating the status of Moses' revelation vis-a-vis the rest of the halachic corpus as its exclusive, stable, and immutable core. However, okay, fine. So stop that for 1 second. So it used to bother me a lot that you have all of this machlokus about what you count in Taryag and what you don't. Okay, and like you have basically the Rambam and the Ramban fighting over which ones are part of Taryag. So what always bothered me, and I don't know if this bothered you, is like, why do they take Taryag so seriously? It's one drasha from Rabbi Simlai, right? The only source of Taryag is one drasha from Rabbi Simlai, and you have Rishonim who hold that there aren't Taryag, right?
I don't know Ramban himself.
Right, Ramban himself, and he acknowledges that there are other shitos who say that it's locked up with Taryag.
I don't know if it's really that satisfying. Why?
Okay, I don't remember. I was going to ask you what his answer was.
Why.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So right. So I think that I can't speak for the Ramban, but for the Rambam, this is the answer, and I've heard this answer stated in the name of Rebbe, not in exactly this lashon, but that this sentence that I just read here, this continues the goal of the first rule, namely isolating the status of Moses' revelation vis-a-vis the rest of the halachic corpus as its exclusive, stable, and immutable core. In other words, if this were just a matter of like, we have to count up the mitzvos, then it seems like overkill. But if it's a question of what is the core of Torah, or what was given at, like what is the Dvar Hashem, and Taryag is just like a shear of that, so then it becomes much, much more important what you count and what you don't count. Now, it doesn't explain the element of the question.
Sorry, should I go?
Yeah, that'd be really nice.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. It doesn't answer the question of why they take this one midrash so seriously,
Yeah.
Right, but so I haven't looked at the Ramban's addressing that recently. No, so it doesn't explain why it has to be Taryag. Yeah, right. I'm relating to Taryag by saying that like it's lav davka Taryag. Rambam definitely holds it is like davka Taryag. But what I mean by that is like the essential endeavor of the whole chachma of trying to find Taryag is really trying to identify what is the core of Torah and what is not. And that's why, like, the most radical view of all of the shitos of minyan and mitzvos, in my opinion, is the Ralbag, who holds that the Rambam got all the Shorashim right, but he didn't apply them correctly. And if you apply them consistently, you will get Taryag. So that really shows that he holds that really the main thing is just trying to isolate the core of the system from the other stuff. And Rabag holds that Taryag is not like 100% necessary.
What is Taryag?
613 mitzvos.
Wait,
Yeah.
So that's more controversial.
It's more controversial. It's yeah, to me that sounds more controversial because he's taking the results of the Rambam. We'll catch you up in a second.
Making sure that you set this Moshe and Torah and law.
Yeah.
You don't have the same thing, you just don't come up with the same number as you have to look at.
That is true, right? I guess I don't know, something about the way that he's saying it, especially in contrast to what he was saying the other shitos are, of that there's a much blurrier line between rabbinic innovation and like Sinaitic revelation.
To me, that's never mind. I think that might be more natural. I'm not a natural.
Yeah, I don't know what the word is.
I'm not a theme, like
yeah. Right. So we're going to see that a lot today. Yeah, we're going to see that a lot today. Okay. So let me just catch up on what we've been looking into here. Okay. So the broader question is when you have drushos from Chazal, right? When they learn things out through the 13 Middos, Torah and Nidreshes span, Kal V'chomer, Binyan Av, Gezer Shava. Right. So the question is, what is the status of those things? Okay.
Like the things that they learned out.
Yeah. Are they d'oraisa or are they d'Rabbanan? Okay, so the Rambam, we've been going through the Rambam's Sefer Mitzvos, where he has the 14 rules for what you count as d'oraisa. His first rule is you don't count derabbanans as part of the 613, okay, which he says you would think that that'd be obvious, but other counters of the mitzvos do count them, which is,
which must mean that they have other d'oraisa ones that Rambam counts that they don't count in order to not end up with the surplus of 613. Right?
That's the Rambam's. He says if you apply their system consistently, you get thousands of mitzvos, and he says that's why it's not a good system, But so that's one rule. But then the rule that we've been doing this week is he says if you find if you find a drasha in the Gemara, halachic, we're talking only halachic drashas. If you find a halachic drasha, okay, and there's no pasuk that explicitly says the mitzvah
in the Gemara.
If you find a drasha in the Gemara, but there's no pasuk in the Torah that explicitly says it's a mitzvah.
There's no pasuk in the Torah. Yeah, okay.
And Chazal say this is d'oraisa, or they say this is guf Torah, then you count it.
Is that the same thing?
Guf Torah just means like part of the corpus of Torah. Yeah. Then you count it as d'oraisa. Okay. But if not, if they don't say explicitly that it's d'oraisa, then you assume it's d'Rabbanan. Okay, and what we're doing now is, so that was what we did yesterday. We're reading this book by Moses Halbertal, and he's walking us through his analysis of what the Rambam shitah is. And today we're going to focus on the machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban, because the Ramban takes issue with this.
Okay, so I want to ask this, because I was discussing this with somebody.
Yeah,
telling me I wasn't aware of this, that one of the pushbacks of the 13 articles of faith is that it also codifies.
This has nothing to do with 13 articles of faith.
I know.
Okay,
but
yeah,
I'm asking.
Okay,
if it's the same pushback to that also to this, in essence, or at least there's a relationship, that he was codifying not just halacha mitzvahs, but also like a hashkafa.
Right. So that's
is this the codification. See, when he's saying drasha, we're talking about mitzvahs, or
only
drasha is hashkafa derived.
No, only halachos. Yeah. So that is a legitimate controversial issue. Okay. We're only talking about halachos here and counting what is in Taryag. Yeah. Okay. So let's just read through just to rev back into this, because we kind of deviated yesterday going back. Okay. So we just said that
and you said Ramban.
We haven't read him yet, so we'll read the Ramban today.
Okay, but take issue with what again?
We'll see.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. The second principle in Maimonides' Introduction to the Book of Commandments. We're on page 116 in that book. The second principle in Maimonides' Introduction to the Book of Commandments defines what was given at Sinai. In it, Maimonides states, not everything derived using the 13 hermeneutic principles for interpreting the Torah, or by extension, is worthy of being enumerated. This continues the goal of the first rule, namely isolating the status of Moses' revelation vis-a-vis the rest of the halachic corpus as its exclusive, stable, and immutable core. However, the claims he makes in the second rule go much further, both in terms of its intellectual boldness and in terms of its relationship with the Talmudic literature. Okay, so that's foreshadowing. Okay, bold. Rambam being bold. Yeah. All right. By means of this principle, Maimonides attempts to distance not only prophecies and rabbinic enactments from the revelation to Moses, but also the Torah as it is from the rabbinic interpretation thereof. Maimonides stated that what is derived using the 13 hermeneutic principles of the oral Torah is not worthy of being enumerated. In his opinion, laws that the sages derived using these methods of interpretation do not have the status of a commandment stated to Moses at Sinai and are not included in his count of the commandments. Such laws are considered rabbinic commandments, even though they are derived through interpretation of biblical verses. The status of deoraisa is accorded only to interpretations transmitted by Moses, not to laws produced by sages. And he's going to give examples. Okay, stop me if you have questions, but this is all what we're doing 2 days ago, yesterday. According to According to Maimonides, the distinction between interpretations given to Moses at Sinai and those that the sages created through their intellectual endeavors rests upon the testimony of the sages themselves. Where the sages state explicitly that their interpretation is, quote, of the corpus of Torah or deoraisa, it indicates that they received it as a tradition from Moses. And where they did not explicitly attest to this, the resulting law has rabbinical status. So here's the quote from the Rambam, which we read inside yesterday. Since this is the case, it cannot be said of everything the sages derived using one of the 13 hermeneutical principles that it was said to Moses at Sinai. Yet it also cannot be said that everything found in the Talmud is based on one of the 13 principles is rabbinic, for it is possible that it represents a received interpretation. In other words, like this, you're going to see drushos. You cannot make an absolute rule and say all drushos of psukim are deoraisa or all drushos of psukim are derabanan. Right? You cannot look at the drushos in the Gemara and say all drushos on psukim are halachos deoraisa, or you can't say all drushos of psukim are derabanan. Right? Like you can't say since it's based on a pasuk it's deoraisa, or since the rabbis are darshaning it's derabanan. You can't say either of those.
Okay, and he already gave us a rule just a little earlier that the only time you can't say.
Now he's going to say it right here. Right here.
What was the other thing?
Right. The way to distinguish is thus. Here's the rule. Anything that is not made explicit in the Torah, but which is derived in the Talmud from one of the 13 principles, if the sages explicitly stated that this is part of the corpus of Torah or that it is deoraisa, then it is worthy of being enumerated in Taryag. For the bearers of the tradition have said it is deoraisa. If they have not explained or stated thus explicitly, then it is rabbinic. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but he already said that also. Where the sages state explicitly
right.
interpretations of
right.
the corpus of the Torah.
Yeah, this is now quoting it. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I think there are not answers, so until later. But when you have the fact that more than many times said nothing and point out, oh no, who didn't want it. Like it's not about
right.
That implies that when they don't say that,
right.
It's not.
So that's going to be the core of the Ramban's objection. So we will see that in a little while. Yeah. Okay. So back to Halbertal. Aside from the difference between these two types of halakha, those received by tradition and those created by interpretation, in terms of legal status, Maimonides reintroduces another distinction between them, the distinction we discussed earlier that he raised in his introduction to the commentary on the Mishnah. And this is really where we went to that yesterday and we didn't continue. Legal interpretations received from Sinai are not subject to controversy. Okay, that's a controversial statement, right? So Rambam holds, so this is what we did yesterday. Rambam holds that if you see any machlokus in anything, it must be something that was not given at Sinai.
It seems controversial that we just factor in the Christ.
Yeah, and I mentioned yesterday, I'll say it again, you got to listen to the Suffice here from 1993. Okay.
I'm confused. Why is that controversial? It seems he's saying
I'll say it and I'll say it's slower with like wide eyes. Okay. Rambam's saying that if you see any machlokus on any topic, it means that thing that they're arguing about was not given at Sinai. Okay, so for example, let's say you have a machlokus on whether name a machlokus tanaim or amoraim, like
that's like I think what you're saying.
Any machlokus based on. So I think the way we normally think of it, right, is if there's a machlokus, what it means is that one of them is correct, and in terms of this came from Sinai, and the other one's not correct from Sinai, and whatever, it was lost, they made a mistake, whatever. He's saying no. The whole thing they're arguing about is a matter that
Rabbinic.
is purely rabbinic and it is not from Sinai at all, or it has to do with the Doraisa, but is not received at Sinai.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so your wide-eyed explanation
Yeah.
was sounded like an implication,
Yeah.
which makes sense, but isn't directly, I think, what he's actually saying. It's more like the conclusion.
No, that is 100% what he's saying. Legal
saying-
interpretations received from Sinai are not subject to controversy.
Right, which is different than saying, and therefore,
Yeah.
if someone's arguing about something, it must not be from Sinai.
Yeah, honey,
That's
dude,
therefore.
honey,
I'll read it again from yesterday. Okay. He says, so look in the, you don't have the Hebrew packet, but yeah, on,
Where
so this is, okay, it's on page 8 out of 10. So it's like the back of the second to the last page.
You hear what I'm asking now?
Yeah, I do. And I'm just gonna,
Okay.
yeah. And the reason why I'm just pushing through because we did all this yesterday. Okay. He says that, actually, you know what? No, sorry. I'm gonna shortcut it. I'm gonna do what I did yesterday, reading Hilchos Mamrim. Okay. Yeah, he says in Mamrim, but he says it in a much shorter way, and he doesn't call the people who hold otherwise idiots. Okay. Rambam is very strong on this, and again, it's a very controversial point. Rambam in Mamrim says in 1:5, or 1:3, sorry. Divrei Kabbalah, so words of tradition, right? They're received in tradition. Ein b'hem machlokas l'olam, don't have any machlokas. V'chol davar shetimsa bo machlokas, anything that you find that is argued about, biyadua she'eno Kabbalah mi Moshe. It's known that it's not from Moshe. Yeah, so it's just the corollary of that logically. Yeah. Okay, so going back to Halbertal, just because I want to get to the Ramban today, because I said that we would get to the Ramban like on Tuesday. All right, controversies can arise about laws derived from the 13 hermeneutical principles. The fact that a particular interpretation is not subject to dispute does not give it the status of biblical law unless it is accompanied by testimony that it was transmitted. Okay, so that is something we spent a lot of time on yesterday also, which is like this. Let's say you find something that is derived through the Nidreshes and is not disputed. Okay, you might be tempted to think that that means it's derived. Au contraire,
No,
it's not unless, according to Rambam, unless they say explicitly that it is derived. Yeah. However, lack of controversy is a necessary condition for anything received from Moshe. In other words, it needs to have lack of machlokus and be explicitly identified as derived for it to be derived. It thus emerges from Maimonides' second rule that in order for a commandment to be enumerated and be considered a biblical obligation, it must have been received from Sinai and undisputed. Interpretations that are not attested by tradition are rabbinic. Okay, that ends the review from yesterday. Okay, now we're into new stuff. Okay, now we can slow down a little bit, but not slow enough to skip the Ramban for today. Yeah. Okay. On closer scrutiny, this structuring of halacha indicates that from among the veritable sea of interpretations and controversies in the Talmud, Maimonides attempted to isolate a layer of received indisputable laws. He claims that only this layer has the Oraisa status and only it was given to Moshe at Sinai. Maimonides attempts to formulate this nucleus of the halakhic corpus Maimonides' possessive attempt to formulate this nucleus of the halakhic corpus imposes another distinction on the content of the Talmud. The distinction between received interpretations and interpretations that were not received. And by interpretations, he means like things through the 13 Middos. Okay. The Talmud distinguishes between genuine interpretation and a loose proof text, asmachta. Okay. And I think loose proof text is a good translation of asmachta. Asmachta literally means like a lean on or support, but loose proof text is better. In specific contexts, an interpretation is introduced only to provide textual support for a rabbinic enactment or decree. In such a case, called asmachta, the presence of biblical interpretation does not attest to the biblical origin of a law. Yet, yeah. So you'll find many times the Gemara will quote a pasuk as a proof of something. Okay, and you might think, oh, the fact that it's proving it from Torah means that it is a received interpretation, right?
Meaning
it was given to Moshe at Sinai.
So it's derived.
And it's derived, right? He's saying, no.
It's just an interpretation.
It's not even an interpretation.
Oh.
Okay. He's saying it's an asmachta, which is a loose proof text. Okay. Which means that what they did was that they had a rabbinic decree, okay, or rabbinic law, and then they attached it to a pasuk. Not because it's the source of it, and not because it's derived, but they just attached it to it.
As an example?
So the question of why they did that is a good question. You have, for example, the Rambam who says they did it because you have to remember, and this is hard for us to think of, the only text that existed until the Mishnah, or debatably beyond that, was Torah B'Chsav. So as a mnemonic device, in order to remember everything, they incorporated it into the text. Another reason they did it is because there is a chachmas hakasuv, there is a an art or a science to seeing like the corpus of halacha reflected in the psukim, sort of like a rhetorical thing. Others say that they did it to support its authority in the eyes of the masses. I'll give you an example of this, okay? And this is not exactly a good example because
do that, supporting it just
because if people know that that it is well, I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example that we read yesterday, even though the Rambam didn't use this as an example. So the pasuk says, "Es Hashem elokach tira." Okay, you shall fear Hashem your God. Okay, that's a doraisa, right? Because it says it's commanding you to fear God. Okay, but Rabbi Akiva had a drasha that says that the word "es" is including Talmidei Chachamim, that you should have reverence and fear for Talmidei Chachamim. Okay, now the Bahag, who is one of the people who the Rambam disagrees with, says the fact that drasha exists shows that you should count this mitzvah as doraisa, that revering Chachamim is doraisa. Rambam says no, it's derabanan. But think of yourself in the context of an average Jew. If you know that when the pasuk says fear Hashem and he used the word es, and that also includes fear of Talmidei Chachamim, it gives a certain gravitas to that law that you associate with the context of divine statements, Okay,
so for the example, can you just really quick say how is it that S refers also to?
Because the word, so Rabbi Akiva had this theory that anytime you use Es Hashem elokach tira, that you should fear Hashem your God. So Rabbi Akiva had this theory that anytime you have the word es, then it's a riboy, which means it's including something else. Okay. Another example we did yesterday was kabed es avicha ve'es imecha, honor your father and mother. So that's d'oraisa. Okay. But there's a drasha that says that the extra word es and es, you could have just said kabed avicha ve'imecha, right? But the fact is kabed es avicha ve'es imecha, it means that you're also obligated to honor your
whatever the thing was before.
No, it's just, there's no translation of es. It's just a direct object, but it's an extra phrase. So it is, but it what was that?
In English, there isn't one. I think
right, in English there isn't one, right? So the drasha says that the word es comes to include that you not only do you honor your father, but you honor your father's wife, and not only do you honor your mother, but your mother's husband, and those are extensions of kibbud av v'em. Now the Rambam says that those extensions are derabanan, but if you are reading it as an expansion of the pasuk, you would think that it's doraisa, just like the pasuk is doraisa.
Okay, fine. So he threw in Talmud Chachamim because before it was mentioning Talmud Chachamim?
Yeah. So you're asking where Rabbi Akiva got his drasha from?
Yeah.
Yeah, that I don't know, but that is his drasha. I mean, he darshans all the s's in Torah, every single instance of s that's halachic, then he darshans it. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so just going back to the question, I'll give you an example of an asmachta that's definitely not a proof text. Okay, so there's a pasuk in Koheles that says, Mu'uvas lo yuchal liskon v'chesron lo yuchal lihimanos. Okay, that which is twisted cannot be fixed, and that which is missing cannot be counted. Okay, so the Gemara in Brachos says that which is twisted cannot be fixed. This refers to the fact that if you miss davening Shmona Esrei on purpose, then you can't go make up for it. Okay.
You can't plan to make up for it later.
Yeah, you can't make up for it later. Okay, right? You can't do tashlumin. We have this way of making up for Shmona Esrei. It's called tashlumin. Okay, now if you just read that Gemara, you would think, oh, Chazal are interpreting the pasuk and they're deriving this from the pasuk. Okay, that's what you would think because they quote a pasuk.
That's the twisted thing is a pasuk.
Yeah, right. It's a pasuk in Koheles. Okay, but there's a very obvious factual reason why you cannot say that they're deriving it from the pasuk.
Because that's not what it's talking about.
Because it's in Koheles. Why? Why does that make it?
It's not a from not.
Okay, this is a different reason.
It's not what they were talking about in the first place. Halachically, they were talking.
Different reason.
Did it come before it?
Yeah. Okay, because Koheles was written by Shlomo HaMelech. Okay. Shmona Esrei was invented by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, which was 400 years later. So Shlomo couldn't have been talking about Shmona Esrei and how to make up for your Shmona Esrei because there was no such thing as Shmona Esrei when Shlomo wrote that.
Couldn't you say that that rule is also applies to Shmona Esrei because it's a rule that applies to anything like that? That any time that you plan.
No, because it's not anything. It applies specifically to Shmona Esrei and Kriya Shema. They say specifically those things. No one applies to other stuff.
Kriya Shema predates Shlomo.
Yeah,
So you could just say whatever Shlomo Esrei is, it's gonna be like Kriya Shema.
you could say that if you want, but that's not what I'm saying. Yeah. So my point, Mati, is to show that when just because they're quoting a pasuk, they're not quoting as a proof nor as an interpretation. It's an asmachta. It's a loose proof text. We're saying like, yeah, that's what the pasuk means. Okay, but they don't mean that that's actually what the pasuk means. And that's what, just reading Halbertal now that we've seen these examples. Maimonides' attempt to formulate this nucleus of the halakhic corpus imposes another distinction on the content of the Talmud: the distinction between received interpretations, okay, and interpretations that were not received. The Talmud distinguishes between genuine interpretation on the one hand and a loose proof text, an asmachta. In specific contexts, an interpretation is introduced only to provide textual support for a rabbinic enactment or decree. That's like the example of Koheles I just mentioned. In such cases called asmachta, the presence of a biblical interpretation does not attest to the biblical origin of a law, meaning just because they quote a pasuk in cases like that doesn't mean that it's doraisa.
It's just a mnemonic.
It's just a mnemonic, yeah. Yet,
Sort of like it's like obviously there's got to be some sort of like reason to use one mnemonic over another.
right, and that's the chachma sakasov. That's the chachma of these principles. Like there was a
Rules
whole
to it,
art.
but it's not
Right.
really like the actual meaning.
Yeah, it's not the actual meaning. Yeah. Yeah, the distinction between received interpretations and interpretations that were not received, and the claim that this distinction determines whether a halacha is doraisa or not, is not found in the Talmud. Okay, meaning this is the Rambam's distinction. In the Talmud, a norm that is derived via interpretation based on one of the 13 hermeneutical principles is assumed to have the status of doraisa, even if it was not transmitted from Sinai. If, as it occasionally happens in the Talmud, such an interpretation does not grant deoraisa status to the halacha, it must mean that this interpretation is an asmachta and not a genuine interpretation. In other words, it's the reverse of the Rambam's rule, which is what you were saying, right? Right, yeah. So let them just flesh out the way that Chaim introduced the same concept is, since the Gemara will often quote a pasuk and give an interpretation, say, that's just an asmachta, the fact that the Gemara like does that in specific cases means, yeah, those are asmachtas. But if it doesn't say this is an asmachta, then we should assume it is doraisa.
Right.
And we're going to see that that's the position that the Ramban takes.
I'm just like, I want to more like,
Lower on
more like trying to bring the pocket, like, oh, this is awesome, this is awesome, more like, oh no, it's not awesome, now it's not.
Right.
Right. And really, it's more saying it wasn't a smart and it's often a hot obviously when normally it says that, meaning that
Not so obvious going to the Rambam. Yeah, no, but I mean, I agree with you that if you were just reading the Gemara, if you just learned the Gemara, you would conclude that.
I remember doing this. Like,
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It seems very hard to learn Gemara when the Rambam understands.
Right. All right. We can keep going and see if Halbertal can defend him. Yeah.
So what's Rambam explaining is the case when an asmachta does not say, what was the thing Rambam said? Rambam saying that, oh, in the case that it's...
Rambam's rule was if the Gemara quotes a pasuk and derives it from the Middos,
right,
and says this is doraisa, then it's doraisa. If it doesn't say it's a doraisa, then you assume it's not from Sinai and it's derived.
Okay, and then Ramban, you said...
Ramban we haven't actually read yet, but it's we'll read it inside. I mean, we'll read it inside. Yeah. I was just saying it outside. Okay, yeah. Let's bear with me. Let's do this. Okay, we're gonna read
them up, and then
I know. We're gonna read one. We're gonna read until page 118. Okay. Without stopping, and then we'll go back and ask all the questions. Okay, then I'll be satisfied that we got to the thing we're going to get to. Okay.
Yeah. 118.
Was that what I just said? Oh, sorry, 120. Okay.
To the end of it?
Yeah. Maimonides' determination that laws based on the 13 hermeneutical principles have rabbinic status registered shock among the halachos of his day. Maimonides was asked about this matter by Pinchas the judge, and he reiterated the principle that a law derived by methods of interpretation and analogy, that's the 13 hermeneutical principles, is not doraisa unless explicitly stated. In the response, he referred Pinchas to the rules at the beginning of the Book of Commandments to gain a better understanding of his position. Okay, Maimonides' approach to rabbinic interpretation instigated one of the harshest criticisms leveled by Nachmanides in his glosses to the Book of Commandments. At the end of prolonged objections to this rule, Nachmanides wrote, quote, I am aware that many other Talmudic passages contradict the master's, Maimonides' words, for the content of the master's work is enjoyable and entirely delightful, with the exception of this rule, which uproots large mountains of Talmud and demolishes the fortified walls of Gemara. For students of Talmud, this matter is evil and bitter. Let it drown and not be spoken. Youch.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. According to Nachmanides, laws derived using the 13 hermeneutical principles have derived status in Talmudic literature. He reiterates this tenet time and again. Quote, we have not found such an opinion, meaning like the Rambam, among the sages, for whom the hermeneutical principles were like matters stated explicitly in the Torah, though they may independently derive these matters, Ibid. And later, for these hermeneutical principles are like matters stated explicitly in Torah. Nachmanides reinforced his claim with vast amounts of evidence from the Talmud and pointed out Maimonides' self-contradictions resulting from the discrepancy between the principle he laid out in the second rule and his halachic rulings based on Talmudic sources. In other words, he said that the Rambam himself is not consistent. Okay, the same way the Rambam said that about Lahag. His string of proofs led Nachmanides to reverse Maimonides' rule. This is the thing I've been referencing, this one line. Therefore, we should say, on the contrary, that everything in the Talmud derived in the Talmud by any of the 13 hermeneutical principles is doraisa, unless they say it's an asmachta. Okay, the exact opposite of the Rambam's rule. Anywhere the Talmud derives a halacha exegetically, meaning through these derivations, the presumption is that it is doraisa unless it is explicitly stated that it is an asmachta.
Through these derivations, meaning
The hermeneutical principles. Yeah. In addition to the incompatibility of Maimonides' position with Talmudic sources, Nachmanides raises an internal conceptual problem with Maimonides' understanding of interpretation. Quote, such knowledge is beyond me. It is lofty, I cannot attain it. That's from Tehillim. For if we say that the hermeneutical principles were not received from Sinai, we were not commanded to interpret and explain the Torah with them. If so, they are not true, and truth lies in the straightforward meaning of the verse, not the interpreted meaning, as mentioned in the sage's dictum, that a verse does not deviate from its straightforward meaning, or we will thus have cut off the root of our traditional acceptance of the 13 hermeneutical principles, as well as most of the Talmud, which is founded upon them. Yet, Maimonides reiterates that this does not mean that they are not true. But if they are indeed true, why distinguish between where the sages mention this explicitly and where they say nothing? For if we believe that once something is not written straightforwardly in the Torah, it is not included in the commandments, even those matters mentioned in the Talmud as being doraisa, which were derived by extension or analogy, are not written. Let's see Halbertal's summary of that, and then I'll summarize and we'll stop and ask questions. Nachmanides formulated the conceptual problem as a willy-nilly argument. If Maimonides believes that rabbinic interpretation is not real interpretation, meaning they're not actually like uncovering like the doraisas, and is therefore not considered actual words of Torah, he risks undermining the authority of halacha as a whole. And if rabbinic interpretations are true and proper, why would they not have the status of biblically derived interpretations? Nachmanides noted that Maimonides himself claimed that he did not base his position on the unreliability of rabbinic interpretation or maintain that they are all merely asmachtas. Quote, we read this yesterday also, lest you think that we are precluded from enumerating them because they are uncertain and the law derived from using that principle is perhaps correct and perhaps not, that is not the reason. Okay, hold on a second. This one last paragraph here. If this is Maimonides' understanding, the following conceptual question can then be asked. How can one simultaneously consider an interpretation to be correct and yet claim that it does not have the legal status of the text it interprets? Moreover, Nachmanides' glosses demonstrate the tremendous gap between Maimonides' position and the Talmud's discussion. Maimonides was well aware of these problems and the internal contradictions stemming from the constraints imposed by his second rule. Why then did he see this as fundamental to his method? Alternatively, why did he construct his approach to halacha in such a way that large portions of it might stand in opposition to the categories he imposed on the material? And finally, what exegetical model does Maimonides suggest in order to get out of the conceptual problem raised by Nachmanides? So 3 problems. Problem number 1 is, how can the Rambam say that the rules of interpreting are valid and yet not give the results derisa status? Right. Okay. And number 2, how can the Rambam reconcile his rule with the Talmud? Right, the Talmud, which seems to take the contrary position by identifying things as asmachtas, it implies that everything else is not an asmachta, right?
You're saying by the fact that they have to even say it, so
right.
You're saying in a logical level that you can see that it seems that that's what the Talmud.
Yeah, like when you have, let's say you have like 100 drashos, and by 5 of them, Chazal say, oh, these are asmachtas. That implies that the rest of them are not asmachtas.
There's a need for that move in general, that logical principle. I don't know what it is.
Right, and according to the Rambam, like, no, really all of them are asmachtas unless they say it's derisa. Okay, and then the final question is, what is the Rambam? Again, we assume that the Rambam was a chacham and knew of, Rambam learned Gemara, right? So he knew this, so how would he respond to these claims?
I don't.
Okay, yeah, Yosef.
You have a story because if for the cases where he says halacha which we say no disputes on, if for like all the kashas he was mechalish the answers, his shitah can't be right because then he would not have had the Masorah which he claims to be good. So therefore, I would assume from that he must have had the Masorah about which were real halacha, which we say and which wasn't. So therefore, he could also say his Masorah for other things.
But Rambam's not claiming that identifying something as Masorah is dependent on like post-Talmudic authorities. He's saying that Chazal themselves would say that it's Doraisa. Rambam would never say, let's say Rambam had a page of Gemara with a bunch of drashos, and none of them say that it is Doraisa. Rambam can't say, my father told me it's Doraisa, so it's Doraisa. He's saying it would have to be by Chazal themselves. Yeah, because
This is more basic questions, but one, how much of a grasp should I have on the 13 principles and even how they were derived to appreciate this?
Answer not very much because we also don't have that much of a grasp. The two, the two.
It sounds like they're talking about as if we already know.
Well, if you learn Gemara, you'll encounter them. But like even, I mean, we read through the list. Was that the day? Was it yesterday? Yeah. So we just read through the list in the art scroll. The art scroll has them and it gives examples. And like of the 13, like I recognize like a handful. And I mean, sorry, I recognize a bunch. But if you ask me to explain them, I would only be able to explain a handful. So I'll tell you that just the ones that you are familiar with. Kal v'chomer, right? If something.
Okay, so these aren't things that you're saying from like logic. You could see them. There are 13 things that logically make sense.
Well, Kal v'chomer is a logical one.
Here we were taught in Torah. These are the 13 things that it said in the Torah. I don't remember seeing
okay, so Kal v'chomer is the only one that's purely logic. Okay, the Gezerah Shava is the other one you're probably familiar with, where the Torah uses a word here in this context and the same word here, and then they learn out halachos from one area to another.
Right.
You know,
right.
Or there's other ones like klal uprat.
So where did we get that that's a valid hermeneutic?
So right, so there's the short answer is Masorah, but like there's the ones that we're familiar with are the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael. There's also the 26 principles of Rabbi Akiva. Oh yeah, there are other principles, but it's all we only know it through Masorah.
I think might have some.
So this is all Torah Shabbat.
Yeah, Torah Shabbat. Yeah.
Okay, well that's confusing, man, because then it's like I'm okay accepting that. I don't
Right.
have a problem with that.
Yeah.
I'm just confused.
And interestingly, that's not a matter that they disagree with. Like in other words,
that's why I'm confused.
yeah, right. In other words, Ramban and Rambam don't dispute the legitimacy of the 13 principles.
Right.
It's just that what do you do with them and what's the status of the results?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
They're
Yeah.
basically
What are they?
saying
What are
those
they?
are
Yeah.
rabbinic, even though we receive them from the rabbinic authorities, and we're fine calling them derived of Shabbat derived, I guess. Those are fine. We're calling them that.
Well, here's the thing. Even Rambam can't say that directly because according to the Rambam, things derived from the 13 Middos can be deoraisa if they say it's deoraisa.
Things derived from 13 Middos can be right. No, yeah, right.
Right.
And therefore what? And what's the
and therefore he does hold that these are legitimate methods of drasha.
Sorry.
Right. Oh, I was assuming that they both. I didn't doubt
Right.
that they.
Okay, yeah.
What I'm saying is like I don't get why. Okay, how do I say this? Why wouldn't? Okay, why doesn't Ramban tell him, hey, well, listen, you have no problem with accepting that the 13 principles are essentially like they're derived level.
Yeah.
So why aren't you? I guess that is kind of what he's saying. When he
Yeah, I
says,
thought that's what he was
I guess
saying.
it is what he's saying. The first question that you said.
Yeah, I think at the top
the
of
principles are valid.
right.
Then how are the okay? Fine. Then
Right. I think that's at the top, the excerpt at the top
That
of
pretty
that
much is
page.
that question.
Yeah.
Right.
Fine.
Isn't the Rambam basically saying that they had that from the Torah, and then you want to often in the Torah, it's not actually how they derived it?
He is saying that, but we're going to see.
That isn't saying that like in warm up Russia, like they know the
Okay, so
Russia, they had the Torah, and they all have it Russia.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure, but the next thing is going to reveal what the Rambam holds on that according to Halbertal. So yeah, so let's start reading his answer. Yeah, maybe it is. I'm not sure. Okay, so check this out. Again, he gives a really good mashal. All right, so we're on this next section at the bottom. Is this 120? Yeah. Interpretation and halacha between explanatory principles and deductive principles.
Right.
Yeah.
There's one of the basic questions.
Yeah.
Just as here, do we have a particular position on how we learning these things out? Is there a universal thing overall?
Well, what'll happen is this will trickle down into the poskim. So like in terms of how we poskin, it depends on just how we poskin. Like, you know, like in other words, like it's not like we poskin on this issue.
No, but I'm saying, yeah, do we hold that the drushes that we receive in Gemara, when they're not mentioned as much, whatever the word is, that they're still, they're therefore that the derived, do we hold that way, or
It's not a matter of do we hold or do we not. It's a matter of like whose lens are we looking through. You know, like if we saw this in the Gemara, we'd say, well, the Rambam is going to say
there isn't like a universal
no.
position.
And in terms of the halachic nafkaminas, that'll depend on how we poskin on each and every issue. You know, like in cases where we poskin like the Rambam, you know, then we might hold that something is derabanan, or we might be machmir for the deraisa. You know,
Sure.
Yeah.
I feel like using the Ramban for that.
Well, that's what Halbertal pointed out, that the Ramban says is that even the Rambam is not necessarily consistent in this thing. Yeah.
And it's actually in terms of Nemo that Torah. I haven't encountered anyone who the Rambam when
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, let's go onward. Maimonides' metaphor for interpretation, the key to understanding his exegetical model, appears in the second rule at the beginning of the Book of Commandments. Interpretations are, and I told you guys yesterday, remember this phrase. Interpretations are branches from the roots given to Moses explicitly, namely the 613 commandments. Okay, using the branches metaphor. Someone calling?
Sounds like it.
It does. Where's the phone? Oh, okay. Oh, okay, fine. All right. I was like, is there a bomb? Yeah. All right. Using the branches metaphor, Maimonides addresses the conceptual problem at the base of his exegetical model. To clarify this analogy of interpretation and text to branch and root, it is worthwhile to first distinguish between two types of interpretation. Okay, this is the important part. The first type, interpretation that seeks to clarify or disclose the meaning of the text's terms, and the principles that guide it are principles of discovery and definition. The second type does not explain the text, but draws additional conclusions from it. And he gives a perfect example of this, okay? Check this out. The interpretive principles of the second type, okay, the ones that are drawing additional conclusions, are more akin to deductive principles. For example, let us assume there is a law that says, vehicles shall not enter a public park, okay? One who interprets this may face a problem of definition. What is the scope of the term vehicle? Does it include motorcycles, motorbikes, and bicycles? Similar questions abound. Right. If an interpreter claims that the law forbids the entry of motorbikes, he is attempting to clarify one of the law's terms, vehicle. A different type of legal interpretation is generated if an interpreter wants to deduce from this law a different prohibition, quote, no vehicles allowed in a schoolyard. In such a case, unlike in the first case, it is clear to the interpreter that the expression public park does not include schoolyards. The interpreter is not asking about the scope of the term public park in the manner in which he was asking the first case. Rather, he is trying to deduce a new prohibition from this law by means of analogy or a fortiori argument. That's a kal v'chomer. That is, if the legislator forbade entry of vehicles into public parks out of concern for children's security, kal v'chomer, their entry into schoolyards should be prohibited, right? Because there are more children in schoolyards than in public parks. This interpreter has certain principles by means of which he attempts to derive prohibitions in addition to the existing ones. He is not trying to clarify the terms of the law and what they include, but whether a new prohibition can be deduced from it. Like this distinction between two types of interpretation, interpretive principles can also fulfill two different roles. The first, principles of discovery or definition, and the other, deductive principles. So keep that analogy in mind. It's a good analogy, right? The law says vehicles shall not enter public parks. Certain principles are trying to explain the terms. What do you mean by vehicle? What do you mean by park? Others are saying, okay, we know that the law itself doesn't prohibit going into schoolyards with vehicles, but could we derive it from there?
A larger rule.
Larger, yeah, exactly. Okay.
Well, or rather, would you say, is this the larger rule and there's smaller rules that must be contained, I guess is a better way to put it. It can't be that you're getting a larger rule because then it can't be a kal v'chomer anymore. Because that would make it, you would need that rule, larger rule, first stated in order to know that you can enter into parks.
No, because kal v'chomer goes the other way. It's from light to strict.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You're saying this one must be a small version of the new one that we're
right.
using. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so now see how Halbertal applies this to Rambam. Maimonides maintain that the 13 principles by which the Torah is interpreted are deductive principles through which it is possible to derive additional laws to those given to Moses at Sinai. The laws given to Moses at Sinai are clear, whether by virtue of their straightforward meaning or explanations transmitted through the generations. The process of interpreting by means of the 13 principles does not explain these laws or interpret their terms, but derives new laws from the existing ones. The 13 hermeneutic principles are deductive principles which generate new claims from the laws given to Moshe at Sinai. In these interpretations, we do not explain the prior laws, the roots from which the conclusion flows. For these laws are well known, clear, and not subject to controversy. Interpretation derives the branches that emerge from these roots by means of accepted deductive principles, the 13 principles by which the Torah is interpreted. So he's saying it's entirely within the schoolyard category, that what the Yugam Middos are doing is they are expanding the roots of Torah to new branches that were not included in the revelation.
Would that also mean new deductive principles?
I don't think so. I don't think the Rambam holds that you can get new deductive principles. I think he holds you have to use the ones from the Torah. Okay, this equation of interpretation with deduction recurs everywhere. Maimonides speaks about interpretation by means of the 13 principles. So this is now Halbertal showing that the Rambam actually holds this. Okay, in those cases, he uses the term derive or take out in describing what was derived by means of the 13 principles instead of the expressions to interpret, to explain, or to clarify. He writes thus in his introduction to the commentary in the Mishnah, quote, the laws derived by inference, quote, the matters that we can derive through general and particular, product law and the other 13 principles and many others. In addition, the analogy of commandments given to Moses with roots from which branches can be derived by interpretation recurs again and again in the introduction to the commentary on the Mishnah. Maimonides calls the nucleus that appears in the Torah and about which there's no controversy, the roots / principles, utzul, that's the Arabic term, I don't know how to pronounce it. The comparison to the roots occurs in several places.
Oh, I do remember that. It's actually, it should be like asul.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
You know more than I do on this. The comparison to roots occurs in several places in the commentary on the Mishnah. Quote, the people of each generation make the statements of their predecessors into roots from which they derive offshoots. There's no controversy about accepted roots. Maimonides describes the error of those who believe there can be controversy about the received laws as follows. Quote, they have not differentiated between received roots and derived offshoots. Quote, for two people, if they are equal in wisdom, analysis, and knowledge of the roots from which may one derive offshoots, whatever they derive by deduction will not be subject to controversy. We read that yesterday. The phrasing of roots and branches with the verb derived represents interpretation using the 13 principles as process of deducing new laws from old ones using deductive principles, namely the 13 principles. Okay, so that was all just proving that the Rambam holds this. Okay, this characterization of the 13 hermeneutical principles as principles guiding deduction finds expression in the Mishnah Torah as well, in the laws of Torah study, which we read earlier this year. And you probably did in Rabbi Zimmer's here also. And 1/3, so this is when you're supposed to split your learning time into thirds.
Yeah.
Third Torah B'Ksav, third Torah B'Al Peh, and then the third, he says 1/3 to understanding and conceptualizing the end of a matter from its beginning, inferring one thing from another and comparing one thing to another. He will understand the hermeneutic principles of the Torah until he knows what the roots of those principles are and how he can derive what is forbidden and permitted and the like from the things he learned from the oral tradition. This matter is called Talmud. In his introduction to the commentary on the Mishnah, I'm kind of going fast here because this is all just proofs. Maimonides uses clearly technical terminology to characterize the 13 principles. Quote, matters about which he never heard anything from the prophet, from the branches, they would derive on the law on these matters by inference. Among those laws they derived, there were matters about which there was no controversy, rather there was a consensus. In others, there was controversy between two rationales, one following one inference and the other preferring another inference. For it is the nature of this sort of rhetorical principles that while using them as guiding an inference, such a thing might occur. Okay, he's going to give an example of that in a little while. In this brief description of the use of the 13 principles, Maimonides' main metaphors to the act of interpretation recur. He uses the branches metaphor and keeps repeating the verb to derive. I assume the Hebrew there, I know in the Mishnah Torah it's lahotzi, okay, like to take out. But the true novelty of this paragraph lies in the technical terminology that Maimonides uses for the 13 principles, rhetorical principles, or qiyas, I guess, or qiyas in Arabic. Maimonides does not merely describe similarities that correspond to analogy when explaining the 13 principles. He defines them with technical terminology, the process of deduction. Okay, moreover, it is important, we're going to get to the Ramban, back to the Ramban in a little while, I think. Moreover, it is important to emphasize that the term Maimonides uses, hekesh in Hebrew and qiyas in Arabic, has a long tradition within Islamic law. In this tradition, qiyas is the technique by which the given tradition is expanded and applied to problems not explicitly addressed. Qiyas is the means of dealing with new questions that would not have answers if not for syllogistic expansion, meaning like through the principles of logic. As such,
Comparison, like a like analogy almost, like
analogy, but like formal logic is a syllogism. As such, it does not reveal the meaning of the given tradition. Rather, it serves as a vehicle for its expansion. Maimonides refers to the 13 principles with the expression the principles of deduction, the clearly technical concept of deduction and expansion within the Muslim legal tradition. By integrating this concept with its special meaning, Maimonides reinforces the sense that the 13 principles are deductive principles, not principles of discovery. Okay, now, this is where we get back to the Ramban. Okay, that last thing means that the fact that there is again, remember, Rambam is writing in Arabic to a society familiar with Islamic law. So the fact that he specifically uses this pre-existing term, qiyas, which means taking traditions and applying them to new cases that were not included in the tradition, means that that's how the Rambam conceives of these 13 principles.
Which but that sounds like the idea of discovery, this new thing.
No,
you're saying it's not
right. It's deduction. Discovery means what do we mean by vehicle? Okay.
Oh, okay. So
right.
Redefining a term that we already have.
Right.
Finding the finish for that. We're not doing that. We're not getting something new from what we already have. We're getting something new from something new about something we don't have.
Exactly. So I'm going to use my own analogy within his vehicle thing. So if the law says you cannot bring vehicles into a public park because of safety issues, so then kal v'chomer, you shouldn't juggle flaming torches in a public park. Now, no one's going to claim that public torches were part of the original law. But you could say that based on the reasoning of the law, then you should add a new law of juggling torches.
Okay, so when we generally say, oh, it's a chiddush here, we're talking in the sense of deductive principles, not of discovery, right? When we today use it.
Well, we use chiddush in a different way, in a much broader. We use chiddush to be about a lot of things.
Do we ever like give a chiddush though in a new aspect to the principle that we already like are using in the first place to? We'll talk about.
Yeah, we use chiddush sometimes to mean a new conceptual insight into a pre-existing principle, and then sometimes we use chiddush to mean a new application that has never been applied before.
Use it both ways.
We use it both ways. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Like for example, well, we use chiddush. I think we use it probably more the first way, like it's a new insight. But let's say like there's this is the first example that comes to mind. Okay, but don't like hold me to this. That there's a case that I think the Bali Tosos talk about for the 4 cups, where there was like a, there was not enough wine for everyone. There was only enough wine for like one person to have 4 cups, So I think, I don't know if it was Rabbeinu Tam, I don't know if it was Bali Tosos, I haven't reviewed this in a while, that he came up with a chiddush that everyone else is yotze through one person drinking the 4 cups and making brachos on it, because the essential like thing is in the being mavarech al hakos. Yeah, like I'm really butchering it, but like that was like a new application, to like
a new way of understanding the chiyuv of 4 cups in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it was a new way of understanding it, but resulted in a new application, which Yeah,
because if he needed, obviously the new application was obviously necessary. So he had, in order to get it, he needed to have needed to be justified by a new understanding, conceptualization of the chiyuv.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna make an executive decision. You guys can do whatever you want. Because we missed a day, I want to finish this week. I don't want to go into this next week. So I'm going to continue reading until we finish the Halbertal. Okay. All right. This understanding that interpretation is based on principles of deduction and not on principles, also because the only reason I did this was because I have a shiur to give tomorrow on this. So I also want to finish it. This understanding that interpretation is based on principles of deduction and not on principles of discovery allows us to overcome our conceptual problem. How can the correct interpretation of a text attained through the proper process be considered a correct interpretation without being considered part of the text itself? Okay, that's the Ramban's question. How can you legitimize the Yugamo Middos, but say that the results are not just d'oraisa like the original source? Okay, the image of branches and roots is very effective for creating distance between the interpretation and the text. If interpretation would define the roots and exegetical principles would determine how to discover their meaning, it would be difficult to say about an explanation or determination that they constitute an interpretation of the text and at the same time continue claiming that they are not the text itself. To put this into the analogy, if I am claiming to interpret what the lawgivers meant when they said vehicle, and I said vehicle includes motorbikes, and that's what they meant, but me saying motorbikes is not d'oraisa, that would be like a contradiction in terms. How can I be claiming to interpret what the initial...
Because you're taking a definition away from the derived thing that should include it. You're almost contradicting...
Right. Right. Okay. If interpretation clarifies the terminology of the text, what would be the text be by itself without interpretation? Okay. He goes back to the example. Returning to the example of the law, it would be problematic to claim. Oh, maybe this is where I got it. It would be problematic to claim that motorbike. Yeah. Okay. I must have been that was lodged in my subconscious. It would be problematic to claim that motorbike is an accurate interpretation of the term vehicle, and yet still claim that this interpretation is not part of the text. And that's what the Ramban is accusing the Rambam of doing.
Yeah, that last sentence of interpretation clarifies this terminology of text. What would the text be by itself in interpretation? It's kind of funny. It's almost like yeah, it's like an absurd.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. The text doesn't mean anything by itself. Like that's what you'd have to say, right? In contrast, regarding the additional prohibition of no vehicles allowed in a schoolyard, a prohibition about which we claim that it is not a clarification of public park, but the deduction of a new rule from the existing one, right? There is room to argue that it is true, but not part of the text. True, but not part of the text. Maimonides' view that interpretation is by principles of deduction. Its goal is to preserve the distance between the interpretation and the text without undermining the credibility of the interpretation. So we can say, yes, the people who formulated the law meant public park, and schoolyards are not public parks, right? But it would be a true deduction that we should also prohibit vehicles in schoolyards.
Is it because
because
of a separate? It's a rule that's contained in both of them.
We're deducing, not discovering. So that's why I don't like using the word contained.
So
we're basing our own rule on what the original rule said, but we're not discovering the meaning of the original rule. No one is claiming that schoolyards were ever included. You know what this is like? I mean, and this is beyond my expertise, but like when you have arguments about the right to bear arms, right? So you have people who basically say that, like, you know, I mean, this is not my area at all. Okay, okay, fine, right? So you do have people who say that should include all weapons because self-defense, blah 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 blah, and you have other people who say, like, when the founding fathers wrote, you know, about guns, they had muskets. No one ever thought that, like, you know, assault rifles or whatever would be, like, you know, were included in that. So it's similar to that. Like, are we trying to discern what the founding fathers meant when they made that clause, or are we
discovery?
That would be discovery, right? Or are we, like, you know, using that as a basis for then deriving new principles that we legitimize by saying that they have a root in the Constitution, but these are branches, and we're not saying this is what they meant. I mean, it's a loose analogy.
Yeah, it's like an invention.
I'm not going to go example. Like, if you like that, you can kind of figure out what they meant in like their arms, like what they're talking about, versus you know, what places what the law meant, and it's really just as law was, you know, it's ending equal right gender issues.
Right.
Or what about, like,
that is literally a new
right, exactly.
And then that's what, like,
Okay, that's a good example. Yeah.
Is this kind of like, it's also
yeah,
like the homosexual thing, like, because I don't remember what the exact wording is in the Constitution. I think they were trying to change it from marriage is defined as a man and woman. They're trying to make a discovery, like, well, actually, that was just a language.
Oh yeah, I'm not familiar with how they argue about that. Yeah.
The distinction will be made between what the writers say and what the text says. That you say you're discovering what the text means, and the text just means something different than what the writers thought it meant.
Say it one more time. Sorry. Say it again.
And that you're discovering what the text means, which is something different than what the writers intended.
So I don't think that either of these possibilities encompasses that, because I think the way that Halbertal is framing it is either you are discovering what the text means that the author, in this case God, you know, intended, or you're taking the law and using it as a basis for creating your own laws that are not intended by God, but they're your own inventions. I think those are the only two possibilities according to him. No, because it's derived. Yeah, and the Torah gives the Ramban the right to make new laws as long as they clarify that it's not derived.
Is it not in heaven, but it gives us
right.
To do that.
Okay. Maimonides believed that there is no error regarding anything pertaining to the commandments that are from the Torah. According to him, there's complete consensus and lack of controversy regarding the D'Oraisa core, and consequently, it cannot be claimed that anyone has erred about it. When Maimonides addresses the phenomenon of controversy, he again, controversy here is his translation of machlokes. When he addresses the phenomenon of controversy, he again emphasizes that the root principles are indisputable. Controversy begins at the stage where additional laws are deduced from consensual roots. By the way, this is the first time it ever occurred to me when I read this English that the word consensual is the same word as consent. I don't know why, but I was like, oh, it's the same word, yeah. By consensus,
this one. Oh.
Yeah. I think
have to allow it to be counted.
Right. Right. I think in my mind, the fact that the word consensual is used only in the realm of like sexual relations, and the word sensual somehow got the wires got crossed, and I thought that it was like that, but yeah, okay, fine. I thought that was amusing. Anyway, what is it?
It's related.
No, it's not. I mean, sorry, no, it is, but I'm saying the word sensual though is not related to consensual. Yeah. Controversy begins at the stage where additional laws are deduced from consensual roots. In this model of deduction, now this, Yosef, what I mentioned to you this morning about how you can have machlokas on how to apply Yugam Middos is what he's going to talk about now. Okay, and this is a good example, I think. In this model of deduction, two opposing conclusions can be derived from the same premises without claiming that one of the disputants does not understand the precedents as the other does, or that one of them erred regarding the premises themselves. Okay, in other words, you can have a machlokas, and it could both be legitimate without one of them claiming that you made a mistake or that you don't understand the facts. Okay, how so? However, it is possible that one of them errs in his deduction. Indeed, I believe Maimonies thought that there are correct deductions and incorrect deductions, yet the debate is not about the premises, but about what can be derived from them. In the case of a strict, Muddy?
3 parts of the syllogism, like the terms,
Sound. This is like a sound versus valid thing. Is that what you're trying to say?
it's like if you want to dispute a syllogism, you have to dispute one of 3 things: the logic, the terms, undefined terms, or what's the term? Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So is that what this is?
I don't know. I don't know. I have to read it and refresh my memory on what he says. In the case of a strict logical deduction, debate about the conclusion signifies a lack of understanding or lack of agreement about the premises, right? So speaking of syllogism, so a strict logical deduction, the famous one, right? All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? So there, if you make a mistake, if you make a logical mistake, that must mean you misunderstood one of the premises. Is this a good example? I don't know. Yeah. Okay, fine. Let's go with it. In contrast,
or you misapplied the premise, I guess.
No, because I think in a strict logical deduction, let's do it. Here's a simple one. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So if someone says no, right, it doesn't. So then that must mean that you either. No, never mind. I can't translate this into more abstract
examples. They're just wrong if they say no.
Right, but I think he's trying to differentiate between a strict logical deduction where the only way to differ is if you make a mistake, and then what he's going to say here about exegetical deductions. Let's read hold on a second. Let's read the
That's great.
let's read his contrast. In contrast, with regard to the exegetical deductions that Maimonides deals with, it is possible to be in a situation where the premises are understood and the controversy is about what can be derived from them. Such a controversy stems from the fact that the semantics of the principles of differentiation is not naturally precise. Okay, he's going to give an example if that doesn't make sense, because it doesn't make sense. Here is the place to address the nature of the exegetical deduction that Maimonides describes and its relationship to logical deduction. Okay, back to our good friend, the schoolyard. Let us return to the example of the law. Let us further presume that someone has indeed inferred that if bringing a vehicle into a public park is forbidden, kal v'chomer is forbidden to bring one into a schoolyard. Okay, that's your kal v'chomer. Okay, so if it's a park is forbidden, then kal v'chomer is schoolyard. Additionally, let us presume that we find someone who disagrees, maintaining that this kal v'chomer reasoning is invalid because there is a difference between a school and a public park. According to this disputant, in the school case, unlike the case of a public park, we have an interest in parents entering the schoolyard with their vehicles. In this controversy, right, you could say, therefore, you should allow vehicles into a schoolyard. Yeah. In this controversy, neither party disagrees as to the precedent, meaning they both agree that in the park, it should be asur, or the prohibition from which the additional prohibition is derived. They all agree that vehicles may not enter public parks. The controversy is whether the two cases are analogous. That is, whether a schoolyard is similar to a public park vis-a-vis the prohibition of bringing it in a vehicle. So we're familiar with this with svara, right? Where both sides of the machlokes agree on all the facts, but the question is, how do you conceptually define those facts, and the positions emerge from that.
Are they calling the schoolyard? Is it like a recent, like where the kids play?
Yeah, where kids play, I guess. Yeah.
Basically, they're talking about it's like a school park. They're kind of using.
Yeah.
And they're basically, and then the question would be, is the kol homer because a private, basically a schoolyard is a private place, and private has to be even more strict than the public park would be. If you can't do it in the public park, you definitely can't go into the private.
So
park.
the way I understood it, just because you didn't mention public or private, I thought you were saying like, if your goal, in a public park, you can have kids running around and vehicles could endanger them. In a schoolyard, which is entirely with like little kids, then for sure it's going to be dangerous. But then the other side is saying that no, public park, there's I don't know, like there's a certain
that's as far
undesignated procedures and protocols. But in a schoolyard, then you have parents coming to pick up and drop off kids as part of the course of the use of the schoolyard. So so you can't say it's a good kal v'chomer.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Okay, let's finish. The semantics of deductive principles like kal v'chomer and lexical analogy, gezerah shava, cannot be formulated in absolute terms. In other words, there's no one who can formulate gezerah shava and say, if you apply gezerah shava, you'll always get the same results, right? There's, yeah. Gezerah shava is when you have the same term that's used in two different contexts in the Torah, and the halachos are learned out from one to the other. There's always liable to be some further question. In the case of lexical analogy, what similarity of content does the similarity of language signify? In the case of kal v'chomer, is what we deem the weaker or stronger premise indeed so? In these and similar types of deduction, one can assume that the conclusions are disputed without establishing that each party actually uses a different premise. Meaning you don't have to say that machloksim stem from a fundamental disagreement about premises. Maimonies can thus say that in the deductive interpretation, there is no machlokus about the premises, only about the laws derived from them. This is why Maimonides calls these analogies rhetorical principles, emphasizing that these principles of deduction are not of a purely logical character. This portrayal of interpretation, which emerges from the commentary on the Mishnah and the Book of Commandments, reveals the conception of halacha that Maimonides was aiming for. According to him, there is a core of content about which there's no controversy, which bears a special status and from which the halacha branches out. Its status stems from its direct connection to Moshe. Interpretation built upon this core is not a part thereof because it does not define it. The exegete does not alter or change the concepts and premises, rather he derives new laws from them. There are disputes that might emerge at these deductions, and this is the stage at which controversy enters into the realm of halacha. The core itself is impervious to controversy and is not defined by exegetes. According to this claim, the core needs no interpretation. It is clear whether by virtue of a plain reading or by means of tradition. Since these interpretations do not define the premises, they are not part of the text, but stem from them like branches that snake out of the roots. The exclusive status of Moses is thus preserved within the model. This model, whether because only his words have the legal status of doraisa, or because his words are the foundation from which everything else branches out, though his words are not themselves disputable. Maimonides' conception of interpretation is particularly interesting. At first glance, interpretation refers to the exegete's attempt to participate in the text's authority, as he sees his words as an interpretation that strives to speak with the force of the authoritative text and not with his own force. According to Maimonides, no man can share Moses' authority, even by way of interpreting the text. The comparison of interpretation to branches creates a distance and sets up an authority structure between the deductions of the exegete and the roots themselves. The words of Moses have the same status, have the status of doraisa. The laws deduced from them have the status of rabbinic law. And so just to fill in a gap that he didn't say here, you do, this is like what you were saying, you do sometimes have yud gimel middos that are interpretive or discovering, but he's saying that those are just using methods of like, of asmachta, right? Like when we say pre-eitz hadar means esrog, and we prove it by saying eitz hadar al pirio, priya hadar al eitz mishana lashana, or eitz shatan pirio of eitz yoshave. We're not trying to deduce anything. We're just using these techniques to reveal a unanimous tradition going all the way back to Moshe. But when you have a machlokes using the Yugimel Middos, they're not interpreting the Torah. They're deriving new principles from the roots, and they both agree with the roots. QED. Yeah. So again, his goal here is not to explain the Ramban, but he is trying to show that yeah, but here's the thing, though, is that you can turn that question on its head to the Ramban about if the Ramban holds that all non-asmachtas are doraisa, then why does Chazal have to point out and say this is guf Torah or this is doraisa? It's the exact same question.
Yeah,
Just flipped.
It's not the fact that more
Yeah, one is why.
I mean,
I don't, but is that,
and then so without saying otherwise.
but the Rambam would say no, right? The Rambam would say that,
When you're talking about laws.
no, it's not very clearly, right? Yeah.
Can we say the Gemara just doesn't know they are derived or wrong?
I don't think the Ramban or the Rambam would say that.
I don't see how it'd be possible to not include it at least have it sometime, because if there's Halachos and all these things derived or wrong, clearly there wasn't actually traditions that on what they're saying was derived or wrong.
Just because we don't know it doesn't mean that when Chazal don't say it, then they didn't know it.
But I'm saying
Chas
they
v'shalom.
clearly didn't always know, because if they always knew, how could they have Halachos?
Because they didn't need to spell it out. Why? Okay, I mean,
I mean, how could they always have Halachos and whether laws derived or wrong if they always knew whether laws derived or wrong?
No, you're right. No, but none of the Ramban and the Rambam don't hold that Chazal had a machlokes and what was derived or derabanan.
It's different Halachos.
In Chazal?
I mean, let's say there's a Halachos you're showing probably about shofar and shal, so that's derived. So you don't do it derived.
Okay, so then maybe that's okay. Fine. So that's the Shoresh question then. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what they would say about that. But my point though is that the fact that both the Ramban and the Rambam hold that whenever it is not identified in the Gemara about whether it's derived or derabanan, Chazal 100% knew. Right? Both of them hold that. They don't hold that they didn't say it because they didn't know it. That would be a huge problem. You know, you're talking about like isolated cases where it's a question about whether something is derived or derabanan, you know, but according to the Rambam and the Ramban, the vast majority of cases would fall into this category, and none of them say that.
I think anything off the top of my head, but like, law, law that was used in Torah, right? And then the one thing out about that
Right, but that's also why you need the Rambam's 12 other principles, right? Because the Rambam's 12 other principles, what we've been talking about is just one of the principles.
No,
right? Yeah,
What's the name of
according
this
to
one?
that,
this is the second.
according to this principle, men are not done. Like, certain things you want about a going down, and I want like a bunch of things from like right?
Right.
But then like and talking about them, like all the things are the same as in the public,
Mhm.
right? And it would seem very strange to think that those are all ones.
I don't know. I can't speak to, I don't know. I can't speak to, I mean, from what we've read in the Rambam, it sounds like he would say that, right? And then it sounds like the cases.
It's very hard to meet tomorrow now.
Right.
And tomorrow doesn't appear to be.
Right, but that's because you are walking in with the other premise, though, right? Like if you walked in with a premise that, like, if let's say you were starting off your Gemara for the first time, right? And I said, I just want you to know one thing, Chaim, before you start this whole endeavor, that if something is doraisa, Chazal will tell you. Then you're going to end up learning all the Gemara very differently, you know, and that's what the Rambam is saying. Yeah, you can disagree with the Rambam, but I think it's a stretch to say that that's not what the Rambam is saying. Yeah. Well, here's what we should do. Okay, we should be on the lookout when we read the Rambam and the rest of Rambam Bekius about examples of this. And you know where I think we'll find them? In Korban Pesach, right? When we Blinet or do Hilchos Korban Pesach, because there are a lot of psukim about Korban Pesach, and we'll have plenty of opportunities to test this and see whether whether there's problems there. Okay, let's stop for today, though. Okay, thank you. And next week. Bli Netter, let's go back to Hilchos Talmud Torah, finishing up Perek Vav.
So is this book gonna go